Between the late 1950s and the 1970s, the Soviet Union quietly launched a series of missions to Mars. These weren't science projects, they were acts of war-level secrecy, covert operations masked as peaceful exploration. Some of them didn't even have names, just numbers, codename after codename, file after file hidden behind closed doors, and nearly every one of the missions failed. The probes either crashed, exploded, or vanished in the cold vacuum between Earth and Mars. But these weren't minor failures, they weren't test runs, they were supposed to be firsts. The Soviets weren't aiming to just catch up with the United States in the space race. They were trying to leapfrog the moon and go straight to the red planet to be first, to own Mars. And they were close, much closer than many people today even realize. By the late 1950s, the USSR had sent the first satellite into orbit. They put the first man into space. And while the Americans were still figuring out how to get off the launch pad, the Soviets had their eyes locked on Mars. But they didn't want anyone to know how badly they wanted it, because if they failed, no one could know. Most of these missions didn't even get a public name until decades later. They were internally designated as Mars 1, Mars 2 MV, Cosmos 419, vague names attached to vague hardware, launched with no announcements and buried when they failed. It was October 10, 1960. This was the first interplanetary launch attempt in history. A modified R-7 ICBM rocket, the same kind that had once carried nuclear warheads, was repurposed to send a small payload across 190 million miles of space. But just seconds after it left the launch pad, the rocket lost control and veered off course. The self-destruct command was sent almost immediately. The rocket and the probe were destroyed. The embarrassing failure was buried. There were no headlines, no press releases, and no footage. 4 days later, they tried again. This time the rocket made it to Earth orbit, but just barely. Once in orbit, the upper stage failed to ignite, leaving the probe stranded. Within hours it re-entered the atmosphere and burned up. In Soviet records, the probe was renamed Cosmos 60. Mars 1 actually made it into space, and it was the first Soviet spacecraft to successfully fly towards Mars. It was launched on November 1, 1962. It was equipped with a magnetometer to study Mars' magnetic field, radiation detectors, cosmic dust sensors, and even instruments to sniff out potential signs of water vapor. It sent back 61 transmissions, and then just as Mars was coming into view, the probe went silent on March 21, 1963, roughly 106 million miles from Earth. Zond 2 was launched in late 1964, carrying improved systems and a set of 6 experimental plasma thrusters. This was cutting-edge stuff for the 1960s. It missed the planet by about 1,000 miles, agonizingly close. Another near miss, another ghost probe drifting alone in the void. They had 2 massive next-generation spacecraft, Mars 1969A and Mars 1969B, each the size of a small bus and loaded with cutting-edge instruments for imaging, surface scanning, and long-range communication. To send these probes to Mars, the Soviets turned to their most powerful rocket, the Proton K. This was a beast of a rocket, 190 feet tall, roaring with over 2.4 million pounds of thrust. The countdown hit 0, engines roared to life, and then seconds after liftoff it happened. The Proton K erupted into a fireball that could be seen for miles. The explosion was so massive it shattered windows in nearby villages and sent flaming debris hurtling across the Kazakh steppe. Everything, the probe, the rocket, the launch tower, was obliterated. Just 5 days later, they tried again. This time it was Mars 1969B, same plan, same rocket, and again it exploded. Not in the air this time, but during stage separation. In 1971 they were ready to try again. This time they sent 2 powerful spacecraft, Mars 2 and Mars 3, in a new kind of mission architecture. Each had 2 parts. First, an orbiter to study the atmosphere and take photos from above. Each lander was fitted with an array of sensors, a soil scoop, a weather station, and most intriguingly, a small robot rover the size of a lunchbox called Prop M. On November 27, 1971, the Mars 2 lander hit the Martian atmosphere traveling over 13,000 miles per hour. But something went wrong. Its parachute failed to deploy properly. However, the Mars 2 probe just became the first human-made object to ever touch the surface of the red planet. It just happened to crash. On December 2nd, the Mars 3 lander entered the atmosphere. This time the systems worked. The parachutes deployed, the retro rockets fired, the lander made a controlled descent through a raging Martian dust storm. For the first time in history, a spacecraft soft-landed on Mars. The lander began transmitting a signal. The Soviets were really happy, but then just 14.5 seconds later, the signal went dead. But not before doing something incredible. It sent back a picture. The image was a mess, just a gray blur with static lines, but that image, blurry and broken, was the first ever transmitted from the surface of Mars. Since 2018, the InSight spacecraft has been monitoring earthquakes using the seismic experiment for interior structure. It recorded more than 1,300 tremors. The strongest one, at 4.2 magnitude, was recorded in August 2021. And then in May 2022, the red planet experienced a magnitude 5 Mars quake. In 2018, radar instruments on the Mars Express spacecraft orbiting Mars detected a large underground lake on the planet's southern pole, as well as 3 smaller bodies of water nearby. In 2022, instruments on the ExoMars orbiter showed there are also giant reserves of frozen or liquid water in the Valles Marineris canyons. In September 2022, the Perseverance rover made a shocking discovery. It found organic molecules near ancient water sources. This discovery is important because it was made in a place of ancient river-lake merger, particularly favorable for life. It located in the Jezero crater, 45 kilometers in diameter. The Sherlock instrument on the Mars rover Perseverance, which is designed to identify organic and chemical substances, scanned molecules from the Jezero crater. Recently, the Curiosity rover detected an unusually high level of methane on the planet, 21 parts per billion units of volume. Methane in higher concentrations is found in the Earth atmosphere and is formed due to the emissions of living organisms. The experimental device MOXIE, the size of a toaster, was brought to Mars on board Perseverance. Its parts were printed on a 3D printer from a nickel-based heat-resistant alloy. MOXIE has recently produced pure oxygen from CO2. It works by separating oxygen atoms from the CO2 molecules. The byproduct, carbon monoxide, is released into the atmosphere. The tool is designed to produce up to 10 grams of oxygen per hour. However, after an hour of operation during the first test, the gas output was about 5.4 grams, enough to let an astronaut breathe for about 10 minutes. NASA and SpaceX CEO Elon Musk closely follows scientists' discoveries on Mars. The head of SpaceX actively prepares for flights and promises that we will see the first images of astronauts on Mars in 2029. 14 Raptor engines of the Starship spacecraft have already been tested. Meanwhile, NASA has also chosen Starship as the first crewed landing module for the Moon. Then by 2040, NASA plans to send a crewed spacecraft to Mars, and the Moon will become a base for refueling. Most likely, as experts say, the first crew will land near the planet equator. The canyon with liquid water in the Valles Marineris will be the perfect landing spot. Water is necessary for drinking, growing crops, and sustaining household needs. Elon Musk plans to refuel rockets directly on Mars for the return trip to Earth. To do this, he wants to build a factory on the red planet to produce methane and liquid oxygen from water ice and atmospheric carbon dioxide. Do you think there was ever life on Mars? Let us know in the comments and leave a like if you enjoyed this video. And to stay updated on the latest science news, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.